Go. Oh, good. Well, very well. For those who just joined you, if anyone was not up on the fourth floor with us, where we had 2 book launches by colleagues from the World Bank. For those of you who were not there, a warm welcome to 2.5 days of forced displacement packing information to you. We have as you have seen from the program, a lot of information coming at you, but we hope to create as much space for information coming back to the speakers as well. So we will try to make this as interactive as possible. Sometimes it's going to be a bit of a challenge, and I think for the next 2 hours, it's particularly a challenge. So just to reiterate the program perhaps, Volker and I will say a few words about the Joint Data Center, since we now have a captured audience here, and we will promote a little bit of what we do, what we're about. Hopefully some of you are curious of what this is all about, this center. We will then have Xavier Devictor from the World Bank talking about the World Bank's approach on forced displacement. And then we will have, I would say, the first session with an academic, a colleague who has developed a very interesting data set on laws and policies in developing countries on asylum. There will be comments by a colleague from UNHCR commenting on that paper. And then we will have a colleague from the World Bank who will be talking about a review of literature on forced displacement that has been done over the last year or year and a half or so. And then we'll have perhaps for some, the highlight at 4 o'clock. We have the High Commissioner from UNHCR coming to have what we call a conversation with a thought leader. We have him here for about 45 minutes, which will be a conversation between him and a colleague of ours, as well as a conversation with you. From that, we'll move into a poster session where I think 8 or 9 of you have been invited to prepare posters based on your papers, your academic papers. And so that's a lot of food for thought. There will be food for your tummy and for the energy level as well. There will be coffees and teas here lined up on the side to keep you awake, especially if you've flown from far away to join us. So that's basically the program for the next few hours. So let me go into a short presentation that Volker and I will do. Just introducing this new kid on the block. As of August last year, and really inaugurated only in October last year, we now have a joint data center on forced displacement. This is a partnership between the World Bank and UNHCR I sometimes describe it as inject energy, passion, new ideas, and money into the data sphere on forced displacement. We have been asked to really work on a 3-4 year time horizon so that when you look at the space of data on the 70 million forcibly displaced plus their host communities, when you look at that space, what we know about this community in 4 years, you should feel much more secure about the figures that you look at, and also you should be looking at many more pieces of statistics, relevant statistics for programming and policy making. This has come to be thanks to a very generous contribution by the Danish government, and Thomas Thompson is here. Thank you very much. Not only do they provide finances, but also conceptually designed this partnership. And we are also supported financially and intellectually and in other ways by the European Commission, the EU, as well as the US State Department, and we have representatives here for both those organizations and governments. Thank you very much. So the way that we were going to do this little introduction is that Volker will talk a little bit about the context of the center, and then I will come back and say a few words about our mission, our main objectives, and a little bit about our work program for the next year, for this year and beyond. But Volker, why don't you set the stage for the JDC?
Sure, thank you very much, Björn. So indeed, in order to introduce us well and to place the JDC and its genesis, it's good to quickly see the context of what is now the last decade and the broader trends overall. And of course, we've seen a significant increase, uptick in forced displacement globally over the last decade, or in the previous decade. And what we'll quickly introduce is a few, what I loosely term paradigm shifts for the sake of this presentation, that will then make it a bit clearer where the entry points for us as the center are or will be. So in the context of this growth, just in absolute numbers, we of course see a couple of other trends that stand out, which is the forced displaced populations being mostly present in less developed, underdeveloped countries, and that we have a significant population, by far the majority at this point, of forcibly displaced that do not live in camps. May have been at some point in time, long ago, the norm or perceived norm, but certainly it is not the norm today. And that brings with it very concrete questions and demands for practitioners, policymakers, and those who work in this field more broadly. And it is essentially the question of how do you deal with a situation of forced displacement that happens in the midst of the everyday life, the reality that I would call for, on the one hand, development, and the question is therefore for humanitarian actors, refugee response actors, and others to define better what their interventions should be. So in this context, the context of growing numbers, changing locale of the forcibly displaced, or emphasis thereof, and in a broader need, in the context of a broader need to bring spheres closer together. UNHCR and the World Bank have, over the last few years, intensified their collaborations in very practical and concrete terms on a variety of projects in this domain. And the JDC, and we're lucky to be here as representatives of that, the JDC is a very recent expression of that, with the clear understanding that in this change of paradigm and this evolving situation, what is not available or not yet available sufficiently is information, data, and ultimately evidence to tackle the challenges that I briefly touched upon. So with that in mind, it brings us to the JDC specifically.
So I think we could make it really easy for ourselves and just ask you to read the brochure that you had in your folder. The two slides that I'm going to show here basically are both found in this brochure. So just to be very clear, first of all, I think about the mission, what we're all about. To enhance the ability of stakeholders to make timely and evidence-informed decisions that can improve the lives of affected people. And we then go down to the affected people. What is the scope of our mission? It is the 70 million of forcibly displaced, meaning refugees, IDPs, stateless people, asylum seekers. And so it's that universe, but it's not limited to that. it's also the host communities, because that's one of the big, where we have a dearth of information, is the people who host the 70 million. So that's very much part of our mission. And in the interest of time, I'm just going to jump straight to our work program. The work program is around the 5 objectives that we have set ourselves: to strengthen data systems, to fill data gaps, fill data analysis and knowledge gaps, and to improve data access and sharing knowledge. And I hope that over the coming 2 or 3 days, you'll be able to see more exactly what this means. I'm not going to use the time because we simply don't have time to go into each of these 5. But you will find a number of colleagues from the center. I think there are 10 or 12 of us here today, and I would encourage you to talk to them, particularly on any of the 5 areas of work that you are particularly interested in. Again, we're just at the inception, but and so far we have been building up towards a work program for ourselves, and we hope we will have our first board meeting in 2 weeks, and we hope that they will approve a set of activities, 25, 30 or 30 activities, and that we are proposing to take on board for 2020 and beyond. And all those 25, 30 activities will in one way or another fit under these 5 objectives. So you will hear much from us. One of the objectives is number 5, perhaps particularly relevant to you or to us today. It's about knowledge sharing, about creating some sort of community or practice, and that is very much focused on getting you as part of the wider research community to give you more access to more data and better data, and to have you do even more work on this, one of the biggest global challenges of our times. So let me end there. Thank you very much for listening, and I'm going to soon hand over to the next speaker. Thank you. You do? Yeah.
So without further ado, let me quickly introduce Xavier Devictor, who will be talking to us about the World Bank perspective on forced displacement. Xavier, and I hope it's okay to start with that, but it's generally true that has been not only a strong supporter and a guide in the JDC's inception, but really without him we wouldn't be here. And it speaks to his vision and insight into his work as an advisor for the Fragility, Conflict and Violence Group at the World Bank. And with previous experience in many countries, including those directly relevant to the topic, like Egypt, Yemen, and I understand a previous life even with UNHCR in the Balkans, this is, of course, many insights that we can only dream of. And with that, I hand over to you, Xavier.
Thank you very much, Volker, for your very flattering words. I just would like to start with 2 remarks. The first one is that this is not about data. This is about people. This is about people who live in very, very dire circumstances, and this is about finding ways to best, or at least to better support them. The second point I'd like to make is that if I'm here today, if many of us are here today, it's because we need you. We need the data community, we need the academic community. We have very significant amounts of resources. We need to make sure these resources are deployed as effectively as possible. And the truth is, we do not have the data, we do not have the evidence yet that would make it possible to be as effective as we wish to be. And so I just would like to really emphasize that this is not only an academic discussion where we each present papers, engage in discussion and so on. This is really the ferment of a conversation that we need to have if we are indeed to take the support that we provide to refugees and host communities and IDPs and other people affected to the next level. So having said that, I was asked to basically just say a few words about the way the World Bank Group is looking at the issue of forced displacement. And I'll start by saying that, we're not a humanitarian organization. We do have immense respect for the work of humanitarian organizations, but our role, our mandate, our comparative advantage is to bring in a development component to the international response to situations of forced displacement. Now the question is, what does it actually mean? Is it the same thing with different words, with different buzzwords, or is it actually something fundamentally different? And we had a number of in-depth discussions with UNHCR a few years ago to try to define what exactly would this entail and how can we best complement what we do across this famous humanitarian development nexus. So I'd like to start by maybe a few remarks which I'm going to try to put in very provocative words just to keep everybody awake. We're not interested in people who are forcibly displaced because they are displaced. Our mandate is about poverty reduction. We're interested in them because they're poor or because they're vulnerable to poverty, right? And from our perspective, our support is only one part of a broader set of interventions that also include humanitarian interventions, that also include political, diplomatic, security interventions, and where we need to really work on the basis of our comparative advantage. And so that brings us to saying that our focus is really on the medium-term socioeconomic dimension of the issue. Now, when we say medium-term, what we say is not short-term. We're not an emergency relief. We're not a relief organization, and frankly, we would not be terribly good at it. When we say socioeconomic dimension, what we're saying is this is not legal protection. Not because legal protection is not important, but because there are others who are doing legal protection far better than what we could do. And so it's always this notion of complementarity and of looking at each of our agencies as part of something bigger, rather than as a silo or a solution in itself. So it's not about development replacing humanitarian assistance. It's really about development and humanitarian assistance working hand in hand in those areas where they have a comparative advantage. And as a development organization, we come to the table with this notion that the best way for us to engage is to support national governments. Their leadership is key. And unless we recognize that their leadership is key, there's very, very little place for development interventions. So from our perspective, it's first and foremost about government leadership, national leadership, and it's first and foremost about trying to support the adoption of policies or the strengthening of institutions that are necessary to manage the situation in an effective manner. And as I mentioned here briefly, we also recognize that forced displacement is fundamentally of a very different nature from economic migration and calls for different responses in many cases. So our focus is on both the displaced and their hosts. Not only the displaced, but also the displaced and their hosts, because once again, it's an approach based on the question of poverty, the question of vulnerability to poverty. Now, the question when you think about refugee programs is, well, why would we need a refugee program? We have poverty reduction programs. These people are poor. Why do we need a dedicated refugee program? And the answer from our perspective is because they're poor differently. Their poverty has different characteristics. Now, that immediately brings the question of how different? What exactly are these differences? Which brings us, and this is my first inroad into this, to the mandate of the JDC. Right? Unless we can quantify these differences, unless we can characterize these differences, it's going to be terribly difficult to try to reduce them. Similarly, when we think about host communities, I think we very often emphasize the word host. I think what we would like to emphasize is about communities. These are communities living in developing countries, often in lagging regions of developing countries. They're facing their own development challenges, and because of an inflow of people from the outside, the circumstances in which they can develop are transformed. So the question becomes, what are the best development approaches in a context where the community has been subjected to a demographic shock constituted by the inflow of people. I just wanted to maybe spend a little bit of time on this slide, which is really trying to look at the different phases of the crisis and the way we, as a development organization, are looking at it, but also trying once again to make the link with the work of the JDC. So if you think about before the crisis, before people go, could we forecast it? Was it really a surprise when people left South Sudan to go to northern Uganda and Ethiopia? Is it really a surprise when Chad has received refugees for 23 of the last 30 years, from the north, the south, the east, the west, you name it, they got it? Is it really a surprise that in the next 10 years they may still get some? Would there be a way to forecast? Would there have been a way to be alert to the fact that some Venezuelans may leave their country 2 or 3 years ago? And if we had been able to do such forecasting, imagine the number of, or the amount of suffering that could have been avoided. Imagine the amount of suffering that comes from people arriving in an environment that's completely unprepared to receive them. And I think without getting too far away, just across the border, the southern border here, we saw how Germany, obviously a country with huge capacity and with a very strong economy, struggled to cope with an unexpected inflow of people in the summer of 2015. Has this been forecasted? Has this been foreseen? I think it's fairly clear that the response would have been better organized, and in the process, lots of suffering would have been avoided. So I think the question is, are there ways to forecast these things? Are there ways to use data to forecast these things? And when we look at it at a more individual level, whenever people leave, some people stay. Now, do we know who stays, who leaves? Well, if we want to help those who stay, we need to know that. Do we know what makes people leave at a certain point of time? Well, if we want to be able to accommodate them, to receive them in the best possible manner, we need to know that. Now, when it comes to the crisis, what we see is that we always talk about, the impact on host communities, but this impact is much more complex than we sometimes make it to be. There are some distributional elements. There are some issues that pre-existed that are just being exaggerated or reinforced or made or aggravated by the shock. So what do we exactly know about this? Do we know who is affected when refugees arrive? Do we know who suffers? Do we know what the impact is on the quality of schooling for the local children? Do we know what is the impact of letting refugee work or of not letting refugee work? Who gets impacted and in which way? And once again, unless we have data on this, it's very difficult to go to a government and encourage them to provide this or that right to refugees without being able to tell them, and by the way, this is what you should also do to make sure that your people benefit too. When it comes to the refugees themselves, as I mentioned before, we know very little. We know very little about what has happened to them. We know actually very little in terms of the cycle of life of refugee. How many get displaced multiple times? What is the average duration of the stay in a given place? How long do they spend in this transitional situation, be it in a camp, being somewhere else? And how can we help children go to school if we don't have a sense of how frequently they tend to change school, or if we don't have a sense of how many years of schooling they've already missed, right? So once again, huge number of data if we want to be able to be effective. Let me close by the solutions, right? So the solutions are typically described as return, naturalization, resettlement, which is essentially a legal solution, right? The refugee goes back under the protection of a state, which is a very, very important dimension of the solution. But from a socioeconomic perspective, that's not the end of it, right? For us, remember, the rationale for our engagement was really that these people had acquired a certain number of characteristics that made them poor or that made them vulnerable to poverty. So the question is, when is it that they have overcome these characteristics? And just before this session, we were talking with colleagues from the European Commission about what do we know about IDPs? When do you stop being an IDP? After 30 years in an IDP situation, do you still have features, characteristics, vulnerabilities that make you different from your neighbor who happened to be a rural migrant? Or has your situation normalized? We know very little about this. And once again, if we want to help people effectively, we need to know much, much more. So let me maybe close with a few words about the money. And this is probably of limited, the details are probably of limited interest in the context of this session. But essentially, we have a number of instruments to finance investments that are of a medium to long-term natures, and that benefit or that aim to benefit refugees and host communities, to try to mitigate the impact of the presence of displacement for the refugees and of the presence of displaced for host communities, to try to facilitate sustainable solutions. We try to avoid durable solutions for obvious reasons, and to strengthen the notion of preparedness, right? So essentially, we have two instruments. For those of you who are interested, we can provide, you'll see further details. We have what we call the Global Concessional Financing Facility, GCFF, which is essentially a pot of grant money to improve the terms of our lending to middle-income countries for projects benefiting refugees and host communities. Lebanon, Jordan, Colombia, soon Ecuador are the main beneficiaries of this instrument. And then we have the IDA window for host communities and refugees, which is essentially for low-income countries, a mix of grant and what we call credit. A credit is a 0% interest loan over 35 years with a 10-year grace period. Pretty good terms. Think about your mortgage. Pretty good term. So it's a combination of credit and credit and grant. In the last 3 years, it was about $2 billion. In the next 3 years, about $2.2 billion. So reasonably large amount. And as you see on this map, we are trying to engage everywhere from the Latin American, the North or South America, and the Venezuela crisis, to a number of countries, in Africa, to the Middle East, to South Asia, through different instruments. So just wanted maybe to close here, where I started. It's huge amounts of money. It's huge amount of suffering. I think we collectively have a moral duty to make sure that the money is used as effectively as possible. And frankly, it's very difficult to do this without the evidence, without the data that you can help us collect and disseminate. So thank you very much for your presence here, and we really look forward to working with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Xavier. And with the challenge to us all, and certainly to the group here over the next 2 days, we can move into the next segment, which is a good example of how new data sets, new approaches can ask and inform and challenge also the way we do business. So for that, I would like to welcome to the stage Christopher Blair and Grainne. Christopher is coming over from the University of Pennsylvania, and he is part of a group of 3 academics who have produced what is known for short as the DRAP. Am I saying that right? Yeah. Which is a new data set that covers 92 developing countries with on its data on laws related to forced migration from 1951 to 2017. And as per Christopher's own statement, his interest broadly is in politics off and across borders. So, of course, a perfect focus for the agenda that we're trying to focus in on. The fellow researchers I should mention are Grossman and Jeremy Weinstein, and the 3 of them have authored an interesting paper that I encourage you to study closely. We will have a presentation of the data and the substance by Christopher first, and then we'll have Grainne, who will respond to with some thoughts and insights as the director of the Division of International Protection in UNHCR. Now, Grainne, we've known each other for some years. Grainne is going on 30 years, I think, in UNHCR.
26.
It's 26. Not a year spent outside where it matters the most, whether it's the Balkans and the Great Lakes in the 90s, Afghanistan, Darfur the following decade, and Iraq, Syria thereafter, including spells in Geneva, New York, and the like. Grainne really comes with all the insights when it comes to this topic in particular. And we look forward to your insights and responses to Christopher's presentation. With that, over to you.
Thank you. Would you mind if I stand there so I can keep an eye on that screen? Thank you.
Would you mind if I sat there so I can see your screen?
Please,
and then
yeah.
I'll come back. Because then I see you.
Yeah, thank you to the organizers of this terrific conference, the Joint Data Center. Again, my name is Christopher Blair. I'm at University of Pennsylvania, and this is work jointly with Guy Grossman, also at Penn, and Jeremy Weinstein at Stanford. Sorry. So there's a popular narrative in the media about forced displacement from the global south to the global north, focusing on things like flows from Syria to Europe or the Mediterranean migrant crisis. And these are important, but they obscure some of the empirical reality of forced displacement around the world, particularly the fact that 84% of the world's forcibly displaced people are hosted in the developing world. The fact that we need to study developing world asylum policy is reinforced by another fact, which is that the average protracted refugee situation lasts 26 years now, meaning that host countries' policies are deeply important to the people that are forcibly displaced. And third, because we're seeing increasing restriction on resettlement in the global north, and we have these protracted conflicts in the global south, integration into host countries in the developing world is becoming one of the few remaining possible durable solutions for forced migrants. Now, practitioners are rightly focused on south-south migration, and a lot of you in this room study that. But we're approaching this from an academic perspective, and notice that in academia, we're largely neglecting global south migration policy, and particularly forcibly displaced people in the global south. In a recent review article by Adamson and Serapis, they note that we lack an adequate comparative framework for understanding differences in policymaking regimes on migration between the global north and the global south. We can see this focus when we look at existing migration policy indices, which are all wonderful, but focused mostly on the OECD. And in the gray columns, you can see a substantial lack of coverage of the Middle East, Africa, and South and Central Asia, where a majority of the world's refugees reside. Now, there are reasons for this academic neglect, namely that there's a strong presumption that de jure policies don't matter in the developing South. One, because of enforcement gaps, meaning there are big gaps between de facto outcomes and de jure policies. and two, because there's some evidence which suggests that, especially in information-poor contexts, like in the Global South, where migrants are generally unaware of policies, then they can't really enter into the decision-making calculus. There's also been a lack of data, as I mentioned. Our project challenges some of these assumptions, building on some initial interviews and fieldwork we did in Uganda, and I'll elaborate as I proceed. But overall, the fact that academics have neglected the study of forcibly displaced policies on forcibly displaced people in the Global South means that we have some important open questions that are left unanswered, and these are just the ones that we study in our paper, but obviously there are more potential applications of the data I'm going to present. One, what is the distribution of policy frameworks in the Global South? Are they changing over time? Under what conditions do we see large liberalizations or restrictions in policymaking on forcibly displaced people in the Global South? And then finally, do migrants take these policies into account before they make decisions about where to go? So to answer these, we collected new data. We're calling it the Developing World Refugee and Asylum Policy Dataset, or DRAP for short. And we believe that the three key advantages are in its coverage, its breadth, and its relatively simple coding scheme, which should be scalable. So first, in terms of coverage, we code 92 countries in Africa, the Middle East, and South Asia. We're in the process of expanding coverage to 12 countries in Latin America. And as I mentioned, we think that the coding scheme is simple and scalable enough that ultimately we could have global coverage. Compared to existing indices, you can see we're greatly expanding the scope of coverage for countries in the Middle East, Africa, and South and Central Asia. In terms of breadth, we're studying de jure policies, producing an index of de jure policies relevant to forced displacement. It is, of course, difficult to measure de facto policies systematically over time, but we believe it's important to study de jure policies, not least because when problems do arise, it's important to understand if the problem is in an inadequate legal framework or if it's in enforcement. And understanding that leads to different advocacy solutions. We code 54 provisions across the laws in the data set, and we have a theoretically driven aggregation scheme, so the 54 provisions collapse to 14 subfields, 5 fields listed here, and then ultimately one policy score. And we're using summary indices to aggregate, but results are substantially similar with principal component analyses. And now in terms of the simple and scalable coding scheme, we are coding all national level laws and policies on asylum seekers or refugees in our data set. And there are 292 at present in total, 292 laws. And we use UNHCR submissions to the Universal Periodic Review process to begin by identifying the corpus of laws that we need to code and work backwards from there. So, what is the UPR? The UPR is a systematic review process that the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights undertakes every 4 to 5 years for every member state. UNHCR submits a report on the protection environment in each country up for review, and they submit this report for virtually every country, particularly those in the Global South. And the addenda that the UNHCR submits describes the national policy frameworks that we can then use to find laws in existing data sets like RefWorld or the International Labor Organization's NatLex database, and work backwards from there to find the full corpus of laws. Here's an example from Djibouti of the UNHCR's addenda to the UPR. In the first paragraph, they talk about the international commitments the country has made, and in the second two, talking about the domestic legal environment around refugees and asylum seekers. So it's a really useful tool that, again, makes our effort scalable. Now, I'm just going to walk through some of the descriptives, and perhaps the most important thing that we see in the data is that in the Global South, the trend is towards liberalization over time. This is not to say that the average developing country has a liberal policy regime for forced migrants, merely that the trend is becoming more liberal over time, and there is important regional variation. Africa is outpacing the Middle East, for instance. Now, this is a really important descriptive finding because we see the opposite in the global north, taking data from Hatton, who produces a similar index of policies in the OECD and 19 OECD countries. We see that in the global north, over time, the trend is towards restriction. So we have opposite patterns, and this reinforces what we think is a need for clear thinking about policy making in this space in the global south. We can also look at the important regional variation. This is taking data merely from 2017. You can see darker colors indicate more liberal. There is important variation, and it's not merely explained by regional clustering. We can also look at the evolution of this over time. So top row shows you 1960, 70, 80. Bottom row shows you 1990, 2000, and 2010. And we can see that the most substantial moves towards liberalization have occurred in sub-Saharan Africa and the countries of the former Soviet Union. We can also take a more disaggregated view of trends in the data, and again, looking at those 5 fields that I mentioned earlier. So first, in terms of access, which includes things like non-refoulement, something that UNHCR has been particularly adamant about pushing, we can see pretty substantial liberalization over time, but again, with regional variation. Moving to services, including education, aid, and healthcare, somewhat more slight liberalization over time. And a similar pattern plays out when we consider livelihoods, which include rights to work and own property. So similarly, liberalization, but more slight. In terms of movement, another field that UNHCR has been particularly adamant about pursuing in terms of moving away from the encampment model, we again see more substantial liberalization over time. And then finally, participation, including things like citizenship. This is often the most domestically, politically contentious in these countries, and consistent with that, we see the most slight liberalization over time. Another way to think about these trends is to look at when big jumps are happening in countries' asylum policy frameworks. And we can see 62 liberalizations, 9 restrictions of at least 1 standard deviation. Most of the liberalizations, or most of the changes overall, occur in the 90s and 2000s. But again, importantly, we do note some more restrictions in the post-2001 period. All right, to walk you through the main findings and move away from the descriptives, first, we document that intense episodes of neighborhood civil war provide an impetus for policy change, irrespective of the direction. So other factors are going to affect the direction, but the expectation of increased flows of forcibly displaced people, because there's a civil war in your neighborhood, are typically what create the impetus for these large policy changes. One of the factors associated with liberalization is when national policy-making elites have co-ethnics that face discrimination in neighboring countries. And here is a situation where you have a concrete ability to use de jure laws to improve the livelihoods of people coming into your country who are your co-ethnics. Interestingly, we find no generalized evidence that repressive regimes are liberalizing in exchange from aid from the north, but this is relevant in some contexts, Uganda, for instance. In terms of a gravity model of forced migration, we see that liberal policies in the global south do attract more forcibly displaced people, but this is a conditional relationship, specifically conditional on information openness in countries of origin and on ethnic kin linkages. And so information openness in a country of origin allows, so that would be something like mobile penetration, that allows prospective forcibly displaced people to search for information about policy environments in prospective destinations. Kin function 2 ways. 1, to transmit information back about the policy environment, and then 2, to help in the actualization of rights. So if you have a right to work in a host country, kin can both communicate that right to you, and then once you get there, help you find a job and actualize the right. And so overall, we see that liberal policies on services, livelihoods, and movement, free movement, are the most attractive. So total contributions, we present what we think is the first systematic mapping of the policy space on forced displacement in the global south, nearly doubling the existing country coverage of those indices that I cited earlier. We introduce a simple and scalable method for coding asylum policies across countries and facilitate theory building on really what migration policy making in the global south looks like. This also enables new empirical tests, the results of which I walked you through briefly. And then finally, we believe that the data set can aid policymakers in both advocacy and contingency planning. So thank you, and look forward to feedback.
So, in being asked here today to respond and to comment a little bit on this research, there's three things I want to address, and obviously it'll be very brief because I'm assigned 10 minutes. So somebody needs to look at the clock and make a sign when I have to stop, because in typical Irish fashion, if you give me this microphone, I will not stop unless somebody tells me to. So there's three basic areas. Am I disturbing you if I move the microphone? Is it? Okay. So there's three basic things I want to flag to you in my response. First of all, I want to give you a little bit of a sense of UNHCR and why we have an interest in research like this. Second, I want to respond directly to some of the outcomes of the research. And then third, I want to talk very briefly about UNHCR's relationship to academic research writ large in the era of the Global Compact on Refugees and the Global Forum on Refugees that we have just finished. So briefly on UNHCR's interest, I mean, why is it that an organization like ours is interested in research? What is our authority with respect to global and regional and national, both laws and policies on asylum? Because it was said in the presentation, we were cited in several occasions as being very keen on certain things like non-refoulement, or it was noted, and we welcome that acknowledgement that, you know, the submissions that we make to things like the Universal Periodic Review, which is one component of the international human rights mechanisms, because the periodic review is what you see in public. We also make submissions to every single one of the treaty monitoring bodies, so you get a lot more detail when you look through the treaty monitoring body, for example, on the Convention Against Torture, or, you know, there's at least 7 of them, including the treaty monitoring body on the 1990 Convention on the Rights of Migrant Workers. Now, the reason UNHCR does these things, and the reason why we have an accepted authority when we issue an analysis of a national legal framework, and I should have said from the outset that I am your typical international refugee law nerd, so there is nothing I like better than legal frameworks. So the point of entry to this research, we love it, because we have a great faith in legal frameworks, but of course the legal framework is only so good as the implementation capacity and the policies that go with it. So all of these things in conjunction will give you a better indication of where a state rates globally in terms of does it have a good asylum policy or not. UNHCR's interest does not come from a place of humanitarianly motivated goodwill. The reason we are interested in all of these things is because we are essentially de facto the treaty monitoring body of the 1951 Convention. We have that role and responsibility, and it's written into the Convention in Article 35, which refers to the supervisory responsibility of UNHCR as an entity, and by extraction, it then has implications for what signatory states have to cooperate with us on. And this is why we are seen as an authoritative entity globally on data such as the data that has been used for the source of this research, because there is an obligation on states to cooperate with us. In terms of some of the issues that have been raised, what have come out of the research, so I move now into my second point. In terms of where you can find a database on the actual, just simply the legal frameworks nationally, on that your research is not the first, because UNHCR have that data. We do it as part of our 1951 supervisory responsibility. So that data already exists. But I think what's unique about the research that has just been presented is how it takes the same source material out of the limitations of a legal world, of international refugee lawyers as an abstract, looking at a national legal framework and determining whether it's good or bad, and takes it much more in the direction of socioeconomic and sociopolitical research, which are skill sets that we don't necessarily hold within UNHCR. So the same data, a lot of which is publicly available, can then be applied through a different methodology and come up with results which are extremely helpful to UNHCR, to the World Bank, and to a whole range of other entities. So when we first analyzed this research, we saw many opportunities for how research like this would benefit us, and how we as an entity would very much like to partner with people who are undertaking this type of research. We have, in our own realm, we have a tool called rights mapping, which is actually doing something quite similar in terms of looking at all the legal frameworks globally, and then taking them a little bit further and looking at the policy implications of these legal frameworks, because of course, I'm stating the obvious when I say you can have a beautiful legal framework and the worst possible policy or practice at national level. You have states that have signed up to every beautiful international convention, but their national policy is to violate every single standard within that. So we have a capacity to look at the legal frameworks, and we have a capacity, because of the fact that we're physically present in more than 143 countries, through our programs, we have the ability also to look at the reality gap between a legal framework and policy and implementation. And we think that, you know, the partnerships of an entity like ours that has the ability to bring that sort of information to the table, with the academic rigor that certain researchers can bring to the table with skill sets that we don't have, we think that this is a way forward and can really deliver better results for refugees on the ground. Now, going to some direct comments, because there I've been speaking rather generally, but going to some direct comments and observations on the research as has been done. First of all, an observation which may sound very small fry and may irritate people, but one of our observations was that we found that the research is fairly liberal in its terminology in jumping between refugees, asylum seekers, migrants, forced displacement. These things have a legal meaning. And you cannot simply jump from one to the other, because the asylum framework of a country is based in a number of things. Is it a signatory of the 1951 Convention? If not a signatory of the 1951 Convention, does the African Union or the Cartagena Declaration apply regionally? And there is a distinction between what is asylum policy and what is migration policy. And this is very much now reflected on the global scene in the fact that coming out of the General Assembly with the New York Declaration in 2017, specific UN entities were tasked to come up with the different global compacts. So we have a global compact on migration and we have a global compact on refugees. And they are different for a reason, because asylum is not the same as migration. And the term forced migration is not a term of law, it's a term of utter confusion. So you have to be a little bit careful in terms of how you describe things, and you also need, when you're looking at a country's legal framework and its policy framework, you need to look at both asylum and migration, and there can be an overlap in the two which is beneficial to refugees. And we see this coming out a lot now after the adoption of the Global Compact on Refugees and the forum that we've just had, because you see an entity like UNHCR moving much more actively into the realm of looking at asylum and the legal recognition of refugee status under the 1951 Convention, plus or minus your national regime, and then looking at how we can move beyond the three traditional durable solutions of voluntary repatriation, local integration, or resettlement, and look at the much broader migration world and see whether you can get definitive solutions for individual refugees and groups of refugees through using a migration framework. So can a refugee access a state's labor migration framework, not on the grounds that they are a refugee, but on the grounds that they're a highly qualified individual who meet all the other criteria? And refugees are often blocked from these type of pathways because states tend to think a refugee is defined by one thing alone, and they don't look at the refugees through all their other characteristics. Like, I'm a refugee, but I'm also a qualified surgeon, or I'm a dentist, or so why shouldn't I be able to go through a labor pathway? So this, in terms of terminology, you need to be quite careful on it, because mixing and matching does not work. There has to be absolute clarity on that. On the scope of coverage, it's very interesting and positively welcomed by us that this research has really deliberately taken an opportunity and taken a deliberate decision to look at South-South movements. Because as was just said in the slideshow, there are many misconceptions about where refugees are, how they move, what paths they take to move. And the average citizen in the global north tends to think that their country is hosting the highest percent of refugees on the face of the earth, despite the fact that all the data shows the opposite. So it's very interesting to look at the South-South movements. On the question of liberalization or not of asylum policy, I mean, we found some of the findings of the research interesting, but we found them a little bit static, in the sense that a liberalization, you can have a sense of a country having a liberal asylum policy in the first wave of mass influx. This is not necessarily as a result of their legal framework, nor necessarily as a result of voluntary policy choices. This is the result of the realities of geography. If you happen to be next door to the state which expels 1 million people in 3 weeks, as was the scenario of what Bangladesh had to face with the recent mass movements from Myanmar, you tend to have a liberal policy in terms of non-refoulement, open borders, because you have no other choice. Now, when we look at the liberalization over time, we see that the initially liberal approaches in practice tend to become quite restrictive quite quickly when hosting states see that they do not get the financial and political support and solidarity of the rest of the world. And again, this is a fundamental challenge that lies behind why we have taken up the challenge of the Global Refugee Forum, which is premised on an understanding that you cannot have functional asylum policies and practices. You're the one telling me now I have to stop. I'm just finished. You can't have functional policies and practices at national level if you don't enjoy international solidarity in terms of funding. Now, it is also our observation that states do not adopt a more liberal practice just because other states offer them money. So this whole tension between migration control drivers from the north that think that if you invest more money in the initial point of asylum, that will somehow help you with your migration control objectives because refugees and asylum seekers will stay. The data shows that that doesn't work either. So in closing, because I think we also wanted to have some discussion, I would just conclude by saying we find the research fascinating and we see a lot of scope for good partnerships between UNHCR and the academic world. And this is also one of the outcomes of the Compact and the Forum, because we in the last 2 years have just launched something called GAIN. We love in the UN our acronyms. GAIN stands for Global Academic Interdisciplinary Network. So we have also within UNHCR a whole platform of engagement with academic research. It's new, and we need to learn a lot as UNHCR, as refugee lawyers, about how we interact with other disciplines, be it geographers, be it economists. So, I mean, we see that the future lies in these type of partnerships, and only through these partnerships will we improve an understanding of what refugees and asylum seekers face in the real world. Thank you. Thank you.
I do hate to be the one interrupting this fascinating discussion, But we have a presentation, and then as you've seen on the program, we also have the High Commissioner coming to speak here in as few as 25 minutes, but possibly a few more than that. So I'll also be watching my phone for a message, and that might give Paolo a few more minutes before his presentation. But I'd like to thank you once again for those of you who have traveled to Copenhagen, and also to those of you who are following this online. My name is Jed Fix, and I work as an economist at UNHCR, where I've had the great pleasure of working with our next presenter, Paolo Verme, lead economist in the Fragility, Conflict, and Violence Unit at the World Bank in Washington, D.C. Many of you already know Paolo, and certainly most of you would be familiar with his work, which in recent years has really been foundational to a lot of the discussions that are taking place today. Paolo's report, The Welfare of Syrian Refugees, was one of the first to provide comparative poverty estimates for refugees and host community members, and to capture in economic terms and really incredible detail the precarious lives and prospects of this population on the move. His more recent working papers, including the one that we'll learn about shortly on the impacts of forced displacement on host communities, also cover a wide range of other topics, including intergenerational population impacts, health impacts, to optimal targeting strategies, and his work is relevant and very accessible for researchers, practitioners, and policymakers alike. Host communities, as we know, are greatly affected by forced displacement, but there's also an awful lot that we don't know, and Paolo's work here helps to shed some very critical light on that. While in most cases the share of refugees is below 1% of the total population in a country, not enough to have discernible impacts on economic aggregates, we know that the impacts are highly uneven and that they're often distributed across those who are already the most vulnerable. This includes regions which are often facing development challenges of their own, and populations that are also, or sectors of work that are also highly vulnerable. Understanding how these costs and benefits are distributed is crucial to understanding what compensatory measures are needed. It's also fundamental to countering some of the less positive narratives that take hold in the absence of better evidence, and which are of tremendous consequence. So with that, I'd like to welcome our next speaker, Paolo. I'd like to also say a special thanks from those of us at UNHCR, Paolo, for your tremendous partnership over the years and for this work and your contribution to the broader discussions and the state of these discussions today. So thank you. And I think we have some slides. It looks like they're up. Now, Paolo, you told me that you can talk, you can continue talking. So plan to talk for 20 minutes, and then watch me off to the side, and I will let you know how many more minutes to continue talking for. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Jed, and good afternoon, everyone. If you're interested in the numbers, I suggest you come closer as much as you can. The screens are small and the numbers are small. Thank you very much for the invitation. What I'm going to talk about is the impact of forced displacement on our host communities. And what we did was the first comprehensive review of the literature in economics that covers this particular topic. So if you think about the forced displacement crisis, essentially you're thinking about two shocks. One is a population shock. So you have a lot more people in a particular geographical area. And the second one is an expenditure shock, because that particular crisis is going to attract two types of expenditures. One is international aid, and the second one is increased government expenditure. So these two types of expenditures, which vary depending whether you're a rich, middle income or low income country, are essential to understand what exactly is going to happen to the local markets. And when we think about markets, we're really thinking about two markets, and this is exactly what the economists were looking at have been focusing on. And the two markets are the consumer markets, and therefore prices and consumption, and the labor market, and therefore wages and employment. And indeed, these are the four outcomes: well-being, consumption, prices, wages, and employment, that economists have been covered in terms of outcomes when they're looking at this crisis. So these shocks and their impact are expansionary. This is what we have to keep in mind. Imagine a population of people that lives their own country and is settled in a desert, in a camp. Really what's happening is from 0 GDP, this area is growing into an X GDP. Similarly, if you have a population that moves into an urban area, you have a growth effect. So however you're going to think about this crisis, you have to keep in mind that these are expansionary crises from an economic perspective. So economics 101, what happens to demand and supply? Well, they're moving towards the right, which means that things are growing somehow. Now, what we don't know is what are the elasticities of these curves, what are the slopes of these curves, and how far do they move to the right, and whether at the end they actually do move to the right, if you're looking at the medium and long term. So what is the objective of this particular review? First, we want to provide a meta-analysis of all the key results covered by the economics literature to determine the impact of forced displacement on host communities in the consumer and labor market, okay, the two key markets we've been talking about. To determine some of the factors that are associated with negative outcomes. I will explain more in detail later, but why negative? Because this is really where we need to focus on when we turn to policies. And then provide an overview of the econometric modeling, identification strategies, estimation choices, and instruments used by the literature as a guide for empirical economists. Well, we do that for researchers that want to do more research in this area. This is the review in numbers. We're covering 94 years in history, 18 major forced displacement crises, 30 years of publication from 1919. Many of you would know the paper by Devictor in 1990 on the Cubans refugees to Miami. 54 published papers in economic journals, 26 different journals. And from these, we have extracted 868 results that we organized in a database that then we use to do the meta-analysis. We're looking at 4 outcomes for the 2 markets I mentioned, well-being and prices. Well-being in the World Bank jargon is often measured in terms of consumption of expenditure, so prices and consumption, this is your consumer market that I was talking about. We're looking at high-income countries, middle-income countries, low-income countries. We saw before 84% of refugees are in low-income countries, but we're looking across the 3 types of host countries. And we're covering the MENA region, Sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, Europe, and the US. And because of the scarcity of papers specifically on refugees, we expanded to other categories, including returnees, expellees, escapees, and internally displaced persons. These are real definitions that you find in the papers. For example, escapees are a lot of the French people that left Algeria and went back to France when Algeria became independent. So there are these different definitions which are in the literature which you can find. So let's look at the data. Why this review of the literature came so late? Well, this explains why. Starting from the 1990, the first paper we could find in the literature, David Cart's paper, then you have an average of 1 paper in economics published per year, and that's up to 2010. That's not much. So there was really nothing to go on to do a literature review up to very recently. Then you know what happens in early 2011, the Syrian crisis, and then you have the EU crisis in 2015. These are the key events that will move finally economists to pay attention to forced displacement. Up until then, really very, very little. So we started this work 2 years ago, and really was the first time that you had enough papers to do a review. So these are the papers and outcomes. These are all the 54 papers. And here they are divided by outcomes. So we have well-being, prices, employment, and wages. And you can see that the 866 results are not evenly distributed between outcomes. So employment is by far the outcome that has been researched the most, followed by wages, and then prices, and only at the end, well-being. And well-being is not only one type of well-being, it's consumption, it's income, and other ways to measure well-being that we use. And so it's a quite heterogeneous category, which means that the most important outcome, which is household well-being, which is the general equilibrium outcome, actually has been very little researched. We know a lot more what's happening to employment and wages, a little bit on prices, but well-being, household well-being, the main outcome of interest, we don't know that much. These are the 18 crises we've been looking at. I'm sure you know most of them, but there are also crises that maybe you're less familiar with. These are expellees from East Europe to West Germany. We have the escapees from Algeria to France. And we have the IDPs in Colombia, Palestinians in the West Bank. So we have a variety of cases, but very similar in what we said at the beginning in terms of the initial shock that happens to the local economy. There is a wide variety of papers. We have top economics papers that now are published in this area, Quarterly Journal of Economics. We have the Journal of Development Economics, Journal of International Economics, American Economic Journal. So now economics is paying attention to the topic. This is how we constructed our database. Essentially, we put every single set of results on one line for each paper, and each line has two results, the minimum and the maximum in the econometric equations for a specific and most relevant econometric model that the paper uses. So from some paper, we extracted more results than from other papers, and this is something to keep in mind. Sorry, do you go back? But so the data sets is not completely balanced in terms of number of results per paper. This is something to keep in mind for the analysis later on. So lesson number one, economics is catching up. Economics has finally paid attention to forced displacement. This is very recent. Only during the past 8 years that we observe a growth in studies, and we should expect a further growth in the next 5 to 10 years. So we need to keep track of the literature and keep the database updated. So one of the things we're going to do is to make this database public so that every one of you who has new results can update the database. Modeling. So this is the key equation that is used. Very simple. This is the outcome. Y, so one of the 4 outcomes that I have described. Then you have a forced displacement variable, which is essentially either the share of refugees or something similar that describe the size of the shock. And then you have some fixed effects, and then your error terms. Now, this is the basic equation that everybody uses, but the problem with that is that once you compare the models, the key models, across the 54 papers, and you translate them into comparable items, which means that we took the time to look at each individual model, look exactly at the symbology, and turn the symbology into a comparative table, which is this table. What comes out is that there isn't a single paper that is similar to another one, and that you can compare the coefficients. So that is a problem, because at the end of the day, we cannot have any analysis or meta-analysis on the slopes of these curves and the movements of these curves, because these coefficients cannot be compared. So lesson number 2, modeling lacks consistency. Innovation is research is a requirement in academia, so it's not surprising that this is not happening. This is not what journals want. They want innovation. So we're not going to get that out of academia. So who can do that? Well, the World Bank can do that. And the World Bank is very well set to do that, because we can do work cross countries with the same model and replicate the same analysis, which is very similar to what we do with poverty, for example. So let's see the statistical results. So this is the database. These are the 64 observations on well-being. And these are the unweighted and weighted results. Weighted are weighted by impact factor. So if you believe the impact factor are really a sign of quality of papers, then you believe this column. Otherwise, you look at this column, right? So the results on well-being, unfortunately, few observations, but by majority, they're positively significant, meaning that the well-being of host communities is going up when displaced population is coming in. Then we have a very large percentage of non-significant, so there is not much we can say about that. And then there is a much smaller percentage of negative and significant results. Now, this is very preliminary for many different reasons. One is that 64 observations is very small. 2 is heterogeneous. So, take it with a pinch of salt. But certainly different from the rhetoric in the public discourse. If we look at prices, 128 observations, the story is different. There is roughly the same share of negative and positive results. Positive results means that employment prices are going up. Negative prices are going down when you have an inflow of people. But remember, it doesn't mean anything that prices goes up and down. For whom? Maybe for producers it's very good, these prices are going up. For consumers it's not. So it doesn't mean anything in terms of household well-being. You need to understand and disaggregate and understand much better what's going on behind these numbers. Instead, employment is a bit clearer. Positive significance is relatively small as a share, and you have a much larger share of negative and significant. And this is similar for wages. So what's happening in the labor market, it's really different from what's happening in the consumer market, and the effects are much more negative than for household well-being, so your general equilibrium effect, as opposed to the employment wages effect, which is partial equilibrium effect, right? So the question, and where I think we should focus on, is here. So if overall, and assuming it's true, household well-being goes up for in the majority of cases, but the impact is mostly negative when we have a significance. Remember that the largest number of study has no significant results, right? We don't know. Then this is what we need to focus on. What's happening right there? So what is happening to the gray area right here? These are the negative and significant results. If you compare to the rest, they're not that, that many. They're still relatively small number of results, but still, this is what is of interest to us. So lesson number 3 focuses on losers. We start to have hard evidence on the impact of forced displacement. The evidence is not as grim as protracted in the public discourse, so we need to say that. But there are negative effects that we need to understand and act upon. So we need to focus on the losers, and research can help to do that. And so next in this paper, this is what we do. What explains these negative results? So with this database, we were able to tag each individual results according, for example, if it's focused on the informal sector or formal, on skilled labor, unskilled labor. So we had a number of tags that we could put next to these results. And we used these tags to run an equation and calculate the odds ratio of having a negative and significant results as compared to having a positive and significant or non-significant results. So on household well-being, we could pull out only two results. One is that a decrease in household well-being is associated with larger crises. Well, not big surprise there. And when well-being is measured with housing indicators, which I said well-being is heterogeneous, we also use housing indicators to measure it, then as opposed to income or consumption, which is reassuring because income and consumption, on the other hand, have a greater likelihood of producing positive and significant results. Prices, what we learn is that an increase in prices is associated with the short run with high-income countries and food and rental prices. So not great surprises there. We knew that food and rental prices were going up, but we also found out that there are a set of other prices that are actually going down. And that happens mostly in high-income countries. Remember the short run. What we found also for the other markets is that these effects tend to disappear in the medium and long term. For employment, the same analysis tells us that a decrease in employment and significant decrease among hosts is associated, again, with the short run, again, with larger crises. And this time, we find female workers and informal workers. So if you combine the two, you are combining the probabilities. These are the odds ratios. And therefore, if you're female, you're informal, the likelihood that the impact on you of forced displacement is multiplied between the two, okay? And wages, similarly to employment, a decrease in wages is mostly seen in the short run, larger crises, again, female workers, but this time low-skilled workers. So here we were not able to look at informal, but we saw low-skilled workers. So again, if you are low-skilled and you're female, then your likelihood that you will have a negative impact is very, very high. So conclusions. If we look overall, 80–90% of results on household well-being are either positive or non-significant. Negative results are associated with larger crises. So this is the sort of headline that largely contradicts the public rhetoric, but also is the headline with the weakest of the results. We need to do a lot more work on that to understand what's going on, really. The likelihood of a price change is around 80%, so up or down, equally distributed between positive and negative changes. Negative results are associated with the short run, high-income countries, food and rental prices. Here we start to have a number of observations that becomes interesting, and so we need to do more work, but these results start to be quite significant. Instead, employment and wages, and this is where most of economists have focused on, partly because this literature comes from labor economics at the very beginning. 70–80% of results on employment and wages are either positive or non-significant. Negative results are mostly associated with the short run, larger crises, female, informal, and low-skilled workers. Okay? So we start to have some evidence on who are the winners and losers following a forced displacement crisis. Again, this is very preliminary. We hope that this database will build into something much more significant and will make it available. So gaps in the literature, well, I had to put that. We need more microdata, the GDC. We need more studies on well-being. So we need to know a lot more about what's going on after forced displacement crisis on household well-being, possibly measured with consumption and income, and possibly with good data. On transmission mechanisms, we still know almost nothing of what drives what. And so we're very much in the dark about these transmission mechanisms and how we can reconstruct that, seeing the final outcomes and changes in the outcomes. Then impacts on policies. That was very nice to see the paper on policies. And by the way, I think we can do things with these databases together in another database that the UNHCR has on the bilateral movements of people between countries. I think this is something we could discuss. Other sectors, impact on education, health, energy, environment. You know, for some reason, economists have very little interest in these areas. There is something coming out on health and education. There are experiments quite a bit now on health and education, but retrospective studies on forced displacement crisis with panel data or repeated cross-section over time, there is very little. Longer-term dynamic impact. So one thing that came out consistently in our results is that these negative results start to disappear 2, 3, 4 years into the crisis. So that does not mean that we need to sit and wait for the negative effects to pass, but it means that we need to act fast if we want to avoid the negative medium and long-term consequences of these negative effects. Another for displacement crisis, notably IDP situations, we don't have much data on that. We know why, so we need to do a lot more work on IDPs. And we need to start to have comparable methods, equations, possibly using panel data. And so going back to the initial slides, they compare all the models. You know, we need to decide what we think are the best models and start consistently applying these models across countries. And this will help us to understand a lot more for policy than what this literature tell us. And finally, and this is perfect, the High Commissioner is here, and I'm on the slide on conclusions, some indications for policy, so perfect timing. So this is what we could derive at the end of the study. First, because these effects tend to disappear in the medium term, react quickly in the short term. This is essential. 2, focus on larger crises, prevent crises from becoming large, allow refugees to move and disperse over space. This is one of the essential findings. We saw some of the groups that are mostly affected by the forced displacement, the crisis, females, informal, low-skilled workers. So there are not many in terms of quantities, but we need to focus on those groups because this is exactly where the problems are. So the problems are not that large, but they're focused on certain groups of people, and these are the groups we need to focus on. Improve price elasticity of supply, food and houses, connect remote places to markets, improve business and investment climate, issue construction permits. These are all things that are coming out in these papers. So we could not do an analysis of all because these are different results that come from different papers, but these are all results of papers that we found. Tackle rigidities in the labor markets, allow refugees to work, provide support for those with complementary skills, and protection for those with competing skills. This was a very important development of this literature that came out from a number of papers. You need to understand among the host communities who is competing and who is not with the forced displaced people, and then apply differential policies on the different groups. Support adaptation mechanisms like internal migration, skill upgrading among hosts, changes in production technology, new investments, make short-term investment to improve long-term prospects. So on that, I conclude, and I welcome the High Commissioner. Thank you.
See, so I think we have two people who are going to who play the important role in this conversation, and one of those conversation partners is not in the room right now. So we have knowledge dissemination is one of the things that we want to do at the Joint Data Center. And we have launched a seminar series. We have a literature review of academic papers that I hope that you have seen, which contains some 300 plus summaries of academic articles on forced displacement. And then we are launching today a conversation with a thought leader. And to conduct that conversation with a particular thought leader, we have our own, JDC's own Christian Anandpour, Caroline Sargent, and Caroline, would you like to have the chairs up? And yeah, so we'll bring the chairs up. And Caroline is going to interview and have a discussion with the Filippo Grandi, the High Commissioner of UNHCR. We are honored, pleased to have you here. Thank you so much for inaugurating this conversation series and for being here today.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and welcome everybody to Copenhagen and to the Joint Data Center. And I'm really honored to be joined by the High Commissioner, Filippo Grandi. I don't know, Björn, if you mentioned who we have in the room, but we have researchers, practitioners, policymakers, all here for this conference on forced displacement, and with the real critical purpose of trying to strengthen and build the evidence base for a more effective response to forced displacement. And the first thing I wanted to ask you, High Commissioner, is you've just come before Christmas from the first ever Global Refugee Forum, and I thought it would be really helpful if you could give people a sense of how did the forum go, what were the critical outcomes from the forum, and how does that help us take forward the key objectives of the Global Compact on Refugees, just to give a little bit of background and context. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, before I answer, let me say first, thank you for inviting me. Second, I'm not sure I'm a thought leader, but if that's what you want to call me, I'm fine. Not least because there's not much time to think, but anyway, that's another long story. We could have another debate on that. And third, that I am especially happy that this discussion is hosted by this new center, because UNHCR, my organization, and me personally have been very involved from the beginning, and of course with under Björn leadership to really set up this joint project between UNHCR and the World Bank. And therefore, I am honored that I can give a little contribution to the first big substantive discussion with external interlocutors that this center is having. This center is literally taking off as we speak. So it's important also that you advise the center in this direction. Now, maybe just to respond to your question, which is quite complex, so I don't want to go into too many details, simply to say, I think that many of you will be familiar, maybe others less, but the so-called European refugee crisis of 2015-16 unfortunately had a lot of catastrophic effects that you are all fairly familiar with, I guess. But it had one silver lining, that it created, at least in certain circles in the international community, the awareness that on population movements, traditional approaches were failing. Something that, by the way, and I don't want to take any credit for that, I was not even the High Commissioner then, but many of us in this line of work have been saying for a long time, maybe 20, 30 years, that traditional, to consider even only refugee movements, which is one aspect of human mobility, a very specific one, even to consider just that as a humanitarian issue only was insufficient, inadequate, inadequate to provide avenues for solutions and for satisfactory responses, and which, if things, with the growth of this phenomena, would cause problems with incalculable consequences, which is what happened in 2015. Of course, Europe was the receiver at that point of a refugee flow much smaller than what much poorer countries have received in much bigger numbers for decades. But of course, because of all the factors that you can imagine, this provoked a reflection also at the political level, and this was at the origin, therefore, of the famous 2016 summit at the General Assembly, the so-called New York Declaration, the two compacts, one on refugees and one on migrants, and focusing a bit more on the refugee side, that was your question. That compact is really not a new instrument, not a new convention. It was a fairly powerful opportunity to reaffirm the fundamental principles of refugee protection, but also to put forward a number of ideas and solutions, some new, some less new, on how to tackle that. So if we want to stick to those principles and do things in the proper way, respecting the rights of refugees, upholding international protection of refugees, here's a set of practical measures that we are proposing to states. States embraced it, more or less unanimously, not really, but almost. And the forum, the first public manifestation of the compact was this forum that took place a year after, just a few weeks ago in Geneva. The tenets of the compact, and hence of the forum, are really rooted in this notion that refugees, people forcibly on the move, especially in countries with few resources, should be included in national development programs, and rather than be the object of separate humanitarian programs that are short-term and not very effective, sometimes the origin of further discrimination, and certainly not conducive to solutions. So this is one of the several important pieces of the compact, but perhaps the most material one, the one that then the General Assembly, the UN General Assembly, invited UNHCR to pursue in terms of commitments, in terms of pledges, in terms of ideas, through a public forum, including not just governments, but civil society, academia, business, and so forth, and so that the ideas formulated in the compact would find some concrete avenues for implementation. Was it successful? I would say, some of you heard me say that even at the closing of the forum. I think what I said, I think literally was the forum has the makings of success, but then you have to realize that success. You have to do a lot of work to make that success a reality. And to make it a bit simple, on the side of the host countries, whose responsibility and burden the compact wants to alleviate by spreading that burden more evenly, for those countries, the commitments are more in terms of policy, laws, asylum, inclusion, and so forth. The responsibilities on the donor side, if you want to maintain that big division, which is quite blurred in many cases, but on the donor side is really not only more resources, more predictable resources, more long-term resources, but different resources as well. You know, it's one thing to say to a country hosting hundreds of thousands of refugees, we'll give you help to build refugee camps and schools in refugee camps, which is very much the type of approach that prevailed when I was a young field officer and not so young even. But another thing is to tell those countries, you know, open up your schools, your education systems to include refugees, which means that then the resources that are given to those countries are resources that have to be given to their national education systems to make them stronger and capable and able to absorb for at least a period of time bigger populations. I'm giving you possibly the easiest example, because when you start getting into livelihoods, when you start getting into the impact on environment, on host communities, it becomes more complicated, but fundamentally the approach is the same. So great pledges, great statements, a lot of interest. As I just told my own UNHCR colleagues here in Copenhagen, I really wanted this forum, personally, I wanted this forum to be a place of energy and dynamism, because sometimes and very often, and for political reasons, the discourse on refugees is catatonic or negative. So we want to put it, you know, we want to give it a positive energy and spin, which means a little bit of chaos here and there. I think still a lot of lack of clarity, never mind, except that now we need to move in bringing order and clarity to the response. And what this center is, you know, this center will have a fundamental function to fulfill in helping us giving evidence to the arguments that we make for inclusion and for solutions.
Thank you. And you were instrumental in the establishment of this center. So what do you expect to see from the center going forward that will help contribute to generate that sort of dynamism and shift the way we think about responding to crises?
In very simple and slightly provocative terms, I think that an immediate institutional value of this center will be to give a bit of discipline to organizations like mine and a bit less discipline to organizations like the World Bank. This is really what I think this center can do effectively, because it comes at the crossroad between the two. And I think you know what I mean. Then more seriously, well, that's serious too, but also seriously, I think the center should really bring to the let's not say humanitarian, because refugee is a specific aspect of it, to the refugee discourse, or rather the forced displacement discourse, because the internally displaced are a very big aspect and perhaps a bit more unattended aspect of this phenomenon, to bring to the displacement discourse a bit more rigor, discipline, and evidence. Unfortunately, the humanitarian discourse, less so now than 10 or 20 years ago, is still founded, for many reasons that one can understand, on impressions and emotions. I'm exaggerating because, of course, we shouldn't be so self-deprecating. We've also made a lot of progress in measuring, in analyzing, but we need much more of that discipline, frankly, in order to make that discourse convincing, to mobilize resources. This is one easy example, to mobilize development resources, but also to convince countries to keep borders open when the price is so high. That evidence aspect of the refugee and displacement discourse is tremendously necessary also, and this is where the center can make a big contribution, in tackling another discourse rooted in emotions and impressions, which is the discriminatory discourse, the, for lack of a better word, populist discourse, the anti-migration, anti-refugee discourse, which is very big, politically very important, and even when it does not translate in actual rough discrimination, it can translate into restrictive policies. It can translate for many host countries in refusal of inclusion and say, no, 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 it's better to leave refugees in camps, ready to go back, because if we include them, it's actually a pull factor for even more to come. I think that all of this, a more thorough analysis of data and evidence, can really help us counter these narratives. From the simplistic narratives that people are refugees because they come to steal jobs and bring insecurity and threaten our values, to more complex arguments like the pull factor discourse, which in some countries may have some ground. So in order to counter these very sophisticated discourses, you need evidence, you need analysis, which frankly organizations like mine do not have to a great extent. Now, of course, some of you may say we live actually in a world where evidence seems to be almost, people are boasting that they don't care about that the truth is not there anymore. Never mind. I think that there are issues that even if they happen in a certain way in the mainstream, we need to continue to pursue with some determination. And one is the ability to analyze correctly and to put forward a true discourse, even when the discourse coming back is based on patent and politicized lies. One more reason to be rigorous on that, and this is what this center can also help us do.
And how do we manage if we find that the data tells us something that we don't like, or that governments don't like, or that practitioners or humanitarian agencies don't like? How do we manage that?
Well, there I think my organization can help a bit, because most of what we say usually is not liked. So we have a certain experience in massaging those messages and putting them forward to governments of all natures. And because let's face it, politics are irritating most of the time, and very often founded in superficial analysis at best, on lies at worst, but they are a reality. They are a reality. Let me give you an example. I take a bit of risk here, but let me give you an example, which is Lebanon. Lebanon hosts, you probably all know this, that one person, I think in 4, in 5, I don't know, in Lebanon is a refugee, either a Syrian or a Palestinian or Iraqi or other refugees. Now, the discourse of Lebanon, of the Lebanese institutions, with big nuance from according to the spectrum, has been for a long time, this is an unbearable burden for this country. And anybody can understand there is a lot of truth in this affirmation. If you have a country and 1 in 4 or 1 in 3 or 1 in 5, whichever, is a refugee, so not a refugee, people coming to seek refuge from war, from other situations, the burden is very big. However, it is clear that, Lebanon, I think, is where the World Bank and UNHCR is one of the places where we started working together most seriously. In fact, the work done in Lebanon is one of the pieces of work that constituted the foundation of this center. And, the analysis is much more nuanced than that. In fact, many refugees in Lebanon contribute to the economy and the society and other aspects of society in the country. So, but of course, if I go to Beirut, or even if I say here now, but that discourse, then it's false, we need to overturn it, it's not true that they're a burden, I would be making a big mistake. Because I think that you have to analyze this concept of burden in a much more comprehensive fashion than simply economic dynamics, or simply based on a set of data that want to analyze the impact strictly from the material point of view. Impact is much bigger, and political impact is not something that one has to neglect. I'm not sure if I'm clear. What I'm saying is that Some governments may reject evidence on the face of it because it bothers them, and I think that then we need to push back and present evidence. In other cases, the situation, like in Lebanon, will be more complex. That simply, if the GDP is increased by 0.5%, I don't know, something like that. It's more complex than that, and this is where UNHCR, an organization which has experience of what exile means for host countries in political terms. This is, we're a humanitarian organization, but we have a lot of experience in handling that cautiously. This is what we can also bring to this discussion. So, better evidence is an element to improve our responses, including to governments that do not behave well vis-à-vis refugees, but they cannot be taken in isolation. We always need to handle this with great caution. May I make one more point? Sorry to.
No, please do.
When we speak about governments rejecting evidence, we have to also put this into some perspective. And don't forget that even when we talk about our slightly, I'm not so sure how evidence-based that figure is. Well, it is evidence-based to an extent, but how complete that figure is. We always speak about 71 million refugees and displaced. And these are the people broadly corresponding to our definition of what a refugee is. The displacement phenomenon is bigger, of course, but this is what we are focusing on. But even if you take only that figure, we estimate that 85 to 90% of those people are in poor countries or in middle-income countries. And yet, the most blatant debate on exclusion, the most blatant lies, may I say, in respect of the risk, the threat, rather, that refugees and migrants present to societies happens in the rich countries. Now, unfortunately, that discourse has created a big precedent. I'm sorry, this was not a Freudian slip, just has created a big precedent globally, and therefore it has increased the tendency of the big host countries that are not rich countries to also somehow embrace, with somehow more argument, more justification, that discourse. But many times when I go to those countries and say, look, please, keep your borders open. We'll help you. These people are not a burden. We can bring you evidence of that. We can bring you evidence that inclusion can actually be of benefit. They say, okay, that's fine, but what about Europe? What about North America? What about Australia? If they say that it's a burden, I have to say it too, because my public opinion will never understand if I say otherwise. So, it's a complex discourse. That's what I'm trying to convey.
So there's lots of excitement in the research community about UNHCR and open data, not, recognizing obviously the protection needs of refugees. But how can bringing data into the public domain really support the work of development and humanitarian organizations? And can we move this agenda along? Is this something where we can make some real progress?
I think we can. We just had actually this discussion with the staff of the JDC upstairs, and this is a very important point, which I fully appreciate. UNHCR traditionally over the decades has been very conservative in the public use of data regarding refugees in particular, for reasons that you can well imagine, because confidentiality is very important in situations of exile, of refuge, especially in some of them. So by default, if I may say, we have been more on the conservative side. I think, and the Director of International Protection is here in front of me, I think that, and I speak completely under her control, I think that there is a growing awareness that we cannot have the cake and eat it. We cannot continue to have that reflex which is, no data because it's confidential, and yet promote notions of inclusions, of more development aid, of different partnerships, you name it. So we need to find a way forward that is more complex perhaps, but that allows at least trends, at least allows some of the capacity that data have to inform better responses to be utilized. And I think, we just discussed it with Björn and the team, to anonymize data. There's many, many ways, and Björn made a very important point. We can learn also from many other organizations that work, that work in other fields where anonymization has made more progress. So I think that this is it. We will still, however, one appeal to all of you, researchers and practitioners in this area, we will continue to be a little bit conservative on that. And perhaps some of it is healthy. Do remember that refugees are extremely vulnerable. And the vulnerability is not only not going to school or being hungry or being exposed to violence, all of which is true, but the vulnerability is a vulnerability in terms of identity, in terms of knowing what they have done, where they are, where they may be going. All of this, which for most regular people, non-refugees, is routine, is something, there's nothing to hide. In the case of some refugees, there may be something to hide for good reasons. You know what I mean? Don't quote me like this, because otherwise I'll be accused of promoting terrorism. But you know what I mean. There are, refugees fleeing from political violence, from persecution, refugees from the LGBT community. These are just few examples. Require a high degree of protection of their personal data. And so forgive us if sometimes we are overprotective, but it's for the good reason. Let's try to find a way forward and the compromise there.
Thank you. So I don't want to monopolize all the questions, so I thought it'd be good to give our audience an opportunity to perhaps ask a couple of questions. I have a couple more questions, but maybe I give the audience an opportunity to ask a question. Does anybody here? Maybe while they're thinking about their questions, then I can say you have here the academic and research community. If you had one question or issue that you would like them to resolve, drawing on the data we have available to us, because I think it's really important that what we do in this community is really relevant to outcomes and results on the ground. I know this is something you're very concerned about. What would be that key research issue or question that?
Yeah, it's really, actually I'm not saying anything different from what I said, but really resetting the discourse is very, very important. Now, a data project in itself alone cannot do that. But if properly managed and adequately supported by the broader research community, and practitioner community, which is what is happening at this workshop, it can be a powerful contribution to resetting not only this discourse, these different types of negative discourses that at the moment are what is worrying us most, perhaps. Not only because of the terrible things that are being said by politicians, but also in social media or otherwise, but like I said, in the translation of these statements into very negative policies and practices. Because never mind if people speak, but when that speech translates into discrimination, rejection, pushing back people, not saving them at sea, you name it, then it's problematic. So please see this work not just as scientific research, but as scientific research aimed at very practical results. And there's another aspect to that that I also shared once again, as I've done many times before with colleagues in the JDC. Let's make sure that the whole big effort that not only UNHCR, but many other in the humanitarian communities are making to work more closely with development partners, let's make that let's accelerate that. Not in conceptual terms. I think we should not even talk anymore about this nexus because we're all in agreement with that. We need to just make sure that the development part of that nexus produces faster results. You know, I think that for another year or 2 or 3, there's here with us, you know, our special envoy for the Horn of Africa. He'll speak to you tomorrow. I can go with him or can send him to see governments in his region and say, look, now there's a new approach. You'll get a lot of resources for education, and please include the Somali refugees and the South Sudanese. You know, we measure that enthusiasm that we sort of helped fire in those circles is still there. And the forum was a great place for manifestation of that enthusiasm. Enthusiasm does not last if you don't substantiate it with resources, with practices. So in order to accelerate that, evidence, data is really fundamental. Mm-hmm. So see that, once again, it's not just an academic project. It's a very practical project which can help improve the lives of millions if we do it properly.
Yes, and that echoes what Xavier said in his opening remarks about this is about people. I'm going to call on my colleague from the University of Leicester, who wrote me a little note with a question he wanted to ask you, and perhaps you'd like to ask the question, just to kick off a question from the audience. There you are, I'm putting people on the spot, and then I'll go to Anna. Yeah.
Thank you, Caroline. The question was, how do you kind of manage the perhaps divergent incentives between maybe local communities and the state in terms of assisting the refugees they're hosting?
So the balance between host communities and hosted people?
No, the balance between the host community, the very, very low, at the very, very local area, and the state, because they might have
Sorry.
very different incentives.
Should we take a couple, and then Anna, you had to.
Yeah, Anna Schmidt from DEFCO, European Commission. I just wanted to ask you something about burden and responsibility sharing. It's many dimensions. Overall, a sense of fairness in the system. If you were to say the dimension of that where most progress is needed, what would it be?
And we'll take another one. Paolo, you had a question. Who's instrumental in some of the research on Syrian refugees.
Thank you, High Commissioner. My question is the following. From data, more data, we get more research. From more research, possibly we get more policymaking changes in policies. But it's this last nexus which is very difficult. We've been working, thanks to the UK government funding, for 4 years, producing research. And we saw that moving from data to research has actually been very powerful. It's something that you get more data, you do a lot more research. But the very difficult step is how you move forward that research into policy. And that is something that we have not been able to crack. I wonder whether you have a magic bullet for that.
Should we take the other two first? Are there any other? Yes, please.
One more.
Yeah, one more, and then we'll go to those.
Thank you, Ms. Caroline. Thank you, Mr. High Commissioner. I'm from Bangladesh. I have seen these refugee issues of Rohingyas from 2004. I was a university student, so it's almost nearly 2 decades. My question is, do you think really you have access to the very original scenarios of the camps, in Rohingya camps? Because as per I have seen in last 2-3 years, all the higher officials from United Nations, World Bank, or donor agencies, international government bodies are guided. And I have seen that selected number of Rohingyas are met with the officials, and they're trained beforehand that you will answer this in terms of, I mean, you know, we assume what kind of questions you will be asking to the refugees. So they're trained beforehand before you reach there. So the very local newspapers, news, and international newspapers, it's seriously differentiated. Like the international newspapers, they cannot show the real scenarios, what we have seen there on spot. I'm a Bangladeshi. I went there, I lived there 2.5 months, around that areas, and I went 3 times from 2017 till date. So the scenarios I have seen, I have never seen something like that in any international newspapers, any report of United Nations, World Bank, and any other international, publications or something like that. So I doubt, do you really have access to the real scenarios? Do our government, the government of Bangladesh, cooperate you to get to know the real scenarios? Even there is a confusion that IOM and UNHCR has a kind of fight with the government to get access, because IOM is supervising the camps in Bangladesh, and there is something in between that UNHCR is not getting access to that operations. And as a researcher, I feel that UNHCR, if they would get access, the scenario would develop a little more.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, let me reply to this.
Yes,
Is that
please
okay?
do. Yeah.
Briefly, because of course otherwise, these are all very important points that you have raised. On the local and central, government, I think this is a very important question. Just one note on that. I didn't mention, because I didn't want to overburden everybody with details, but probably many of you know that one thing that we did after the New York Declaration and the instruction that we received from the General Assembly to establish a compact, what we did not wait for the compact to be established, which happened only more than 2 years after the New York Declaration, but right that same year, 2016, we invited a number of countries hosting large numbers of refugees to adopt already some of the approaches which the compact promoted. And this is where working with the World Bank and with DEFCO, just to mention 2 organizations that have spoken, that are present here, was so important. So at the moment, that approach, which we have a boring name for, called Comprehensive Refugee Response Framework, which is a broader partnership approach to respond to refugee situations, is applied in about 15 countries worldwide. Why do I say this? Well, one is that I say this because I think that in those 15 countries, or at least in many of them, I think that what we have already started doing with development partners, with governments, etc., is an important source of interesting data in measuring the impact of the approach that the compact wants to promote. But going to your question, in some of those countries, in Uganda, for example, where this approach was pioneered, Uganda was the first one to say we want to adopt this approach. In Uganda, the body that has been created to govern somehow this approach, which is government, donors, partners, operational organization, includes local government. And I think that this is something that I repeat in every other country where this approach is being designed and implemented, that if you don't have local government, you won't succeed. Because your question had an answer implied, that when resources come, and these are bilateral resources, they don't transit through UNHCR, development resources very often stop at the central level and don't filter down where really it is needed if you want to make a visible impact. So when I talk about results, quicker dividend of this new approach, I don't only speak of big amounts of money being given to governments, but I speak about concrete results being felt where the refugees are hosted, by the refugees themselves, but also by the communities hosting them. And that means that local government at the almost community level has to be involved. It's very difficult and complicated and very political too. This is where humanitarian action, is much thinner and more superficial and short-term, but can move more quickly. Development work, because it is linked to governments, at least in its traditional form, is a bit more slow there, but we need to move in that direction. So thank you for that important question. On the burden and responsibility sharing, this is actually the most fundamental purpose of the compact, to promote the notion of burden and responsibility sharing, something that is enshrined in the Refugee Convention and in other documents, but which has never been really implemented properly. And I think that here we have two, in a way, conflicting trends. The compact and the forum generated a good debate on that. Yes, everybody recognized we need to have more sharing of this response. The response is still led or entrusted mostly to a few host countries, especially to the big ones, and to a very small number of humanitarian donors. We need to expand that, if nothing else. Whether it will become global, I don't know, but it can be expanded. So that is positive, more difficult to do than to say, but at least there was a lot of good statements in that respect. We'll work on that. We are trying to figure out how to do that and how to hold everybody accountable to the pledges made. Whether that, however, should not result in something that I see trends of, which is worrying. And the Secretary General, when he came to the forum, said it very explicitly in the press conference. We don't want to go into a world in which responsibility sharing means that some host and some pay. You see what I mean? So that, okay, you keep all the refugees and we'll pay for it. I mean, first of all, it doesn't really even happen. But if that is where we're moving, I'm very worried. That's why I always say that burden sharing, development aid in big refugee displacement situation is very positive for many reasons, but can never exclude the responsibility of asylum and protection entrusted to everybody. So you cannot say, to be very simplistic, since I'm giving $1 billion, I'm not taking refugees anymore. Some states are doing it, as you know, or are saying it anyway. And that is very dangerous. That's not proper responsibility sharing, precisely because of what I said earlier, that hosting a large number of refugees is not simply a matter of economic or social impact. It has other costs that also need to be shared, including the political cost of hosting people, foreigners, vulnerable foreigners, that have no other choice but to seek asylum. You see what I mean? I'm simplifying a more complex argument, but so we need to be careful about when we talk about sharing. On research and policy, I think I've said it very much, and I think that I would agree very much that that's the most difficult step. And this is why, and I don't want to repeat it further, but I'll say it once more, I hope that what this center will do is good use of data, good research, with a view to influence policy and practices, by the way. So it's even further than policy. So this is extremely important. I just don't want to add any more, but I agree that this is the difficult step to make. And finally, I think the Bangladesh point was a very interesting one. First of all, I would be a bit more, I see where you come from, and I would be a bit more nuanced. You know, of course, if I, as the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, visit a country, inevitably what I will see, my exposure to a refugee situation will be fairly limited and fairly scripted. Sorry, there's no two ways about it. I cannot go incognito to visit these places. I'd love to. But, you know, I've been a very junior fielder, so a little bit I know what to ask and how to look for information. But, of course, I am not, I won't come out of that with the complete picture. But, UNHCR has not only in Bangladesh, but in most other places, substantive field presence, permanent field presence. UNHCR works with partners that have even more in-depth, detailed field presence. So there, nothing is ever perfect. I always say that aid workers can be the best and have the best access, but they are not refugees themselves. So there is always a gap there. And therefore, the gap exists, but I think that in reality, access is there. And in fact, this is an important asset that we are bringing to this. We and our partners, humanitarian partners, are bringing to this discussion. It's our presence, our access. This is why, in a way, the World Bank, I think, from early on, understood that it was beneficial to partner with us because we could provide development organizations that have usually even less access to a conduit there to evidence. But it's never perfect. It is sometimes politically difficult. In some places, not in Bangladesh, but in other places, we do not have access. And in some places, it is due to security. In others, it is due to politics. That access is refused. So, access is a very complex issue. But back to Bangladesh for a moment, I would say that, first of all, that issue with IOM, frankly, has been overcome a long time ago, so I hope that we're not going back to it. We have clarified roles and responsibilities, and that was never meant really to keep us away, but it was simply a local construct that became unsustainable once the big influx happened in 2017, and I think we've gone beyond that. But it is true. It is true that there are many actors that have even more access. First of all, the refugees themselves, and I think that they have to be a very fundamental contributor to the data work or the evidence work, and then local organizations. This is why, a strand that is now less mentioned than before, the global, or I don't know what, the World Humanitarian Summit in 2016, and work done around that really promoted the notion that we international organizations should do much more work with local organizations, because one of the reasons for that was the access that those organizations had into the community and into data and into evidence. So I would say nothing is perfect, but perhaps the picture is not as grim as you depict it, and there are political constraints in Bangladesh as there are everywhere. Actually, there are much more in other countries than in Bangladesh, but certainly I think that there are ways to improve that, and we can bring actually that access as an asset.
Thank you. I think we've run out of time, haven't we? Björn is giving me a message. So I'd just like to say a really big thank you on behalf of everyone in the centre, and I'm sure for the audience here, for joining us and spending this time and giving us your perspectives and insights. And I hope that this will generate that energy with this community.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
All right. Before we break, and it won't really be it'll be a sort of a break. I want to introduce and hand over to one of the architects of the Joint Data Center, Ewan MacLeod. Ewan is the director for Resilience and Solutions, as it's called, in UNHCR. And he has promised to introduce our poster session and to really, in a way, open that poster session. Ewan.
Björn, thank you. Good evening, everyone. To be honest, I wasn't really sure what a poster session was when I was asked to introduce it. But I understand that essentially it's presentation of work of young researchers. And I certainly can't claim to be a young researcher anymore. but I have a particular affection for the discipline and the interest. And of course, as Björn said, one of the whole reasons why we created the Joint Data Center was to bring a greater focus and increase the engagement and widen the coverage of topics and researchers, both from the North and the South. So this is a great opportunity. And when I looked down at the list of topics, I have to say I really felt that they were very pertinent and very relevant. And if you permit me a couple of minutes of observations on those, but I understand that the way that the poster session will work is that the individual researchers out in the lobby area or the atrium area will introduce their own subjects, and that you can circulate and listen to them as they present their particular issues. So back to the topics, and I have to wait for 10 more seconds until my boss leaves the room, because I'm going to say something slightly subversive. Oh, I see, I got your attention. No, it's this first topic, the impacts of refugee repatriation on receiving communities. I had the great pleasure of serving with the High Commissioner in the last huge voluntary repatriation exercise that UNHCR has managed for Afghans from Pakistan and Iran in the spring of 2002. And we had a public affairs officer who, this was in the pre-Twitter period, if you can imagine, and he was pumping out daily press releases about what a magnificent achievement it was with all these hundreds of thousands of people coming back. And I, having worked in Afghanistan a number of years previously, was saying to myself, well, actually what's happening is a kind of emergency, because the impact of hundreds of thousands of people on a country, millions actually, 1.5 million, in a very short space of time, on the local labor market, on prices, on the availability of basic goods, to a country with a decimated economy, apart from the illicit drug sector, was a kind of emergency. So I'd be most fascinated to hear what the observations are from that piece. Secondly, there's a number of reflections on the psychosocial impacts of displacement. And it reminded me, and if many of you are familiar with the work of Professor Mary Kaldor at the London School of Economics, and all her work on war and conflict and new wars, as she describes them. And in particular, a phrase that stuck in my mind from a lecture she gave a year or so ago that you can find on YouTube, war as a social condition. And what she gets at in this presentation is the distorting and destabilizing effects on entire societies and communities when they accept, and they come to accept, that conflict is a normal condition. And almost unconsciously, they start to practice adaptive behavior, which you and I, all of us in this room most likely, would consider aberrant and abnormal, but for them is normal. And I heard a Durham University lecturer a couple of years ago who'd done research on the impact of drones on farming in eastern Afghanistan, and how this caused whole patterns of behavior, even in the farming practices, to change, because every time they heard this noise above them, they realized that they were in danger. So they stopped doing things that they did in the summer, at the end of the harvest or the end of the working day, to gather in numbers outside, because they were in mortal danger if they did it. So I think this is a really fascinating topic and most underestimated. Vulnerability and its consequences, yes, slightly controversial again, because UNHCR, a lot in our recent discourse, we have been talking, and I think rightly so, because it was a corrective and balanced the impression that refugees were simply a burden and dependent on humanitarian aid. And we wish to, of course, put across the opportunities that they could bring, the contributions that they can make to a local economy. This is perfectly logical and normal. Somehow in that process, though, we've forgotten that the process of being expelled from your own country forcibly, or taking that decision to leave, when your own family could be shot in front of your eyes, when your community, your housing, your property is confiscated or destroyed overnight. The consequences of that linger for years and years and years. And we should never lose sight of that. And I can only echo what my boss said about the reasons why UNHCR is very often highly protective of data. Because in many of the files and the interviews that we conduct, it's precisely these kind of facts that we capture. And it's important that it's captured and recorded and conserved anonymously. The gender dimension, really, of course, what can I say about that? As a male Anglo-Saxon man, it seems to me we're in danger of an endangered species at times in international organizations these days. Very important, and I want to relay a little bit, again, slightly controversial anecdote, but an important one. Was an interesting study done by a researcher at the Overseas Development Institute on women who were displaced, internally displaced, by the conflict in northwest Pakistan a few years back. And the assumption that most of the humanitarian aid workers made was that these women were placed in extreme vulnerability as a consequence of that displacement. But in fact, what the researcher and the interviews, which was conducted entirely by local researchers, I'm delighted to say, many of them women, found was completely the opposite. Because these people had come from such a conservative and traditional society and context, the process of displacement was actually also a process of liberation from them. And when the idea that they were going to go back back to now safe areas with a sack full of vegetable seeds and some farming tools, the typical response of a humanitarian agency, the women effectively protested and said, no, we've been liberated from that. We don't want to go back to being literally beasts of burden in the field, etc. So just to point out that very often we need to question our assumptions about vulnerability and gender. Finally, of course, irregular migration. And I really, this topic really caught my imagination as well. The unintended consequences of research and rescue operations. This is often a very difficult issue for organizations mandated for life-saving activities. And sometimes we really don't want to admit or acknowledge that there are perverse consequences to this. And that it may well be true that because these search and rescue operations are operating for the best and most noble of humanitarian reasons in the Mediterranean, may also be encouraging people to take risks, to leave their home countries and travel hundreds of thousands or thousands of miles and spend large amounts of money, place their fortunes and destiny in the hands of traffickers and smugglers. We have to be, I think, candid and honest about that. So let me stop here, because I'm sure you're much more eager to hear from the young researchers and the presentation of their work than from me. But I understand that it's now time to move out to the atrium and position ourselves around to hear from them. But thank you very much.